Fantastic. So good morning, everybody. You are here presumably for the Resiliency Planning and Evaluation Four-Pillar Methodology Use Cases Workshop. Today we're going to be having San Diego Gas and Electric and Sonoma County Junior College District presenting on this. My name is Julian Ennis. I'm a utilities engineer with the Grid Resiliency and Microgrids team. Just for a few workshop logistics. If you are joining by computer, you can use the link shown on the screen, or you can phone in using the phone number and access codes provided here. We do recommend that you use your computer to join if possible, so that you can see the slides that are being presented. There's a lot of information in today's presentation, and some fantastic visuals from our presenters, so we wouldn't want you to miss that. Just a couple of notes on today's presentation. The presentation itself is available in the meeting invite. If you follow the link above, you should be able to download the presentation and the agenda announcement. We will also be posting all of this on the CPUC website at the link shown there. The presentation portion of this meeting will be recorded and posted at the same link in a few days' time. Just as a note, while one or more commissioners and their staff may be present, no decisions will be made at this meeting. Next slide. So just a few WebEx logistics, just to remind everybody. We are using WebEx as our platform to host this meeting. All attendees that are on the meeting are muted on entry by default. We will be taking questions two ways today. You can either ask a question verbally using the raise hand function. Basically, if you raise your hand during the Q&A portions, I will go ahead and unmute you, and you will have about 2 minutes to ask your questions. We are asking that after you ask your question, please lower your hand by clicking on the raise hand button one more time, and that if you have another question, to go ahead and re-raise your hand by clicking on that same button. Also, just as a note, if you are asking questions verbally, please make sure that you state your name and your affiliation, just for our records. I'll be reminding folks during the Q&A of that as well. Questions can also be written into the Q&A box, and I will go ahead and read those out during the Q&A portions and have our panelists answer them. We do have closed captioning available. If you go down to the bottom left corner and click on the CC button, it will provide you closed caption transcripts of this meeting. Next slide, please. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Roseanne. Roseanne, go ahead. Roseanne, we can't hear you. Roseanne, we can't hear you, sorry.
You can hear me now? Okay. So my name is Roseanne Mikevich, and I am a senior analyst on the Resiliency and Microgrids team. And just to review quickly where we've been, Energy Division staff has been conducting workshops aimed at diving deeper into some of the more complex aspects of resiliency and how to apply it to policy. In the past year, we've held sessions such as the interruption cost estimate calculator, the power outage economic tool, which are tools that have been developed to look at resiliency from a more top-down econometrics perspective. Sandia did a deep dive on the RenCat and Social Burden Index, which was then followed up in July by a workshop kicking off their pilot project that they're conducting in partnership with SCE. Last month, we heard the results of work done by Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, funded by the DOE Technical Assistance Grant, looking at the feasibility of sharing data from local jurisdictions. And in May, Limit Energy Strategies led the first of resiliency standards looking at metrics, and in September, they held the second of those workshops on metrics. Today's workshop is on use case scenarios of applying the four-pillar methodology as it applies to both an in front of the meter microgrid standard and behind the meter use case campus technology that includes a microgrid, but also considers other resiliency situations. We'll hear opening remarks from Commissioner Shiroma, after which our presentations today will demonstrate on how two different entities have applied this approach to scenarios that need to consider different priorities, hazards, and options. San Diego Gas and Electric will be discussing how the approach can be applied to their in front of the meter utility microgrid solution at Borrego Springs and the iterations therein. And Sonoma County Junior College District will be demonstrating the use of the methodology from a different approach. As I said, on the Santa Rosa Junior College campus that incorporates various resiliency considerations and solutions, which include, but is not limited to, the campus microgrid. And I'll turn it over to Commissioner Shiroma.
Thank you, Roseanne. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Genevieve Shiroma. My pronouns are she, her. Welcome. We're going to hear about some real-life use cases for the four-pillar methodology that has been developed by the CPUC and the team to value energy resiliency investments, to basically do the stepwise process in making decisions, investments, and so forth. I'm the lead commissioner for the CPUC's microgrid proceeding, and in that capacity, I had the privilege of working with the team in guiding the CPUC overall efforts to improve energy resiliency for Californians. This is the 7th workshop, as Roseanne outlined, exploring how California can define energy resiliency, how to measure it, and determine the value for diverse communities across our state. Again, towards this effort, there has been the development of a four-pillar methodology that looks to set a baseline assessment for an existing situation, a mitigation measure assessment, a resiliency scorecard, and a resiliency response assessment for investments. I'm very much looking forward to hearing today how this methodology has been used to value the resiliency efforts of microgrids developed by San Diego Gas and Electric Company and the Sonoma County Junior College District. I've said before, I am an alumni of community college, in my case, San Joaquin Delta in Stockton. Learning lessons from these use cases can help us to use this tool to inform California's energy resiliency planning efforts. I want to thank our presenters today from SDG&E and Sonoma County Junior College District. Very much looking forward to your presentation. I'm very glad that we are recording this so that others may view the presentation and discussions. I want to thank our hardworking Energy Division staff for coordinating this informational session, and in particular, our hosts, Senior Regulatory Analyst Roseanne Rekovich, Utilities Engineer Julian Ennis, and their supervisor, Jason Ortego, Program Manager Matt Caldwell, Deputy Director Simon Baker, and Deputy Executive Director Mom Tesfai. And from my office, my Chief of Staff, Cheryl Wynn, and Advisor Jack Chang. Thank you. Looking forward to this. Very excited to hear this discussion today. Back to you, Roseanne.
Thank you, Commissioner. So to put today's workshop in the context of the guiding principles provided by the four-pillar methodology, each one of these pillars, from baseline assessment to the comparative analysis of mitigation investments through the evaluation of whether those mitigation solutions have met resiliency and policy goals, can be adapted to the unique considerations of the use case to which it's being applied. It can be applied in a specific data-oriented version as a sequential iterative process, or it can be used more generally as guiding principles as one considers complex applications of resiliency design. As a quick review of the four-pillar methodology, this approach provides a scalable, sequential, and iterative process by which resiliency can be assessed. Mitigation measures can be compared and optimized. Resiliency responses can be assessed for effectiveness, and resiliency efforts can be incrementally approved. As a scalable methodology, it could be applied to a specific small application like a single customer solution, a multi-property solution, or as large as a regional bulk grid planning assessment of mitigation strategies. Microgrids are seen in this methodology as but one of many potential mitigation strategies. The details within each of these pillars provides a method to address the myriad aspects of resilience we just talked about. In baseline assessment, numbers 1, 2, and 3 here, identify what do we want to protect and where is it. Numbers 4 and 5 under baseline assessment looks at what threatens it. And number 6 looks at how well are we doing right now to protect it. In pillar 2, the mitigation measure assessment, we look at what protection options do we have, what does the best job at protecting the most, and what does it cost? In pillar 3, the resiliency scorecard, this is a way to score resiliency configuration characteristics that reflect benchmarks of resiliency achievement and includes characteristics that support state policy goals. Resiliency response assessment, pillar 4, represents the iterative nature of the methodology. This is where we use our metrics to answer how well did the investments do in reaching resiliency targets? Did the investments reduce impacts on the community? And what can we do better in our next iteration? These 4 pillars can be used, as I said, as a sequential iterative type of thing, specifically working down the numbers, or as guiding principles. And now I'll turn it over to Stacy Furr from San Diego Gas and Electric.
Hi, Stacy Furr from San Diego Gas and Electric. I work in SDG&E's Advanced Clean Technology Group, and I'm Policy and Strategy Manager. Today I'll be going through the 4 pillars methodology as it relates to SDG&E's Borrego Springs microgrid. If you would like to turn to the next slide, please. Now, SDG&E's Borrego Springs is quite unique in the fact that it is, oh, sorry, it went forward. Thank you. It is situated in a rural and remote community at the edge of SDG&E's service territory. It is a desert community that is surrounded completely by state parks. They have extreme climate and with temperatures reaching 90 to 110. There's even been records of 120 degrees in Borrego Springs. They're also susceptible to monsoon season, so extreme thunderstorms, flooding, and it's a high wind region. The town of Borrego Springs is, as I said, at the edge of SDG&E's service territory, which means that it's at the end of a long radial transmission line that transverses through multiple state parks. The community, because it is situated in a desert, has a high penetration of photovoltaic. We have over 40 megawatts of PV with 26 megawatts connected at the transmission level, 6.5 megawatts connected at the distribution level, and about 8.6 megawatts connected behind the meter for customers. The customer mix in Borrego Springs is quite unique. There are healthcare, schools, there are emergency services. The community, because it is a small desert community, does not have its own hospital, but it does have medical evac. There is business and residential load. There's also significant agricultural load in the area. And in the fall, that contributes to a peak of anywhere between 8 to 12 megawatts. If we could transition to the next slide, please. Now, Borrego Springs has gone through multiple iterations. We are currently deploying Borrego 3.0, but if we were to look back at Borrego 1.0, the microgrid had 2 diesel generators, 1.8 megawatts. It also had a 0.5 megawatt, 1.5 megawatt hour battery energy storage. As we started to transition into Borrego 2.0, we added a second battery at 1 megawatt, 3 megawatt hour. We also added a 3 megawatt load bank in order to help island operations with the excess solar that is in the community. And as we start to transition into Borrego 3.0, we have added a 0.3 megawatt ultra capacitor to the microgrid yard. We have also recently deployed the PICE microgrid controller at all of our existing assets. So both batteries, the ultra capacitor, and our generators. And that microgrid controller allows us to operate the microgrid with the different technologies at once. It also allows us to get to remote operation in a planned outage situation. And it helps us to maintain microgrid frequency and voltage, which is really important in Borrego because of the unique load situation with the high penetration of solar in the region, and sometimes the lack of load to support the excess solar. As we transition to the future, it's important that we are able to maintain customer load in islanding events. And so we are deploying a 7.3 megawatt hour battery, 14.6 megawatt hours. We're also going to be putting a 0.25 megawatt, 4 megawatt hour hydrogen energy storage system out there. You can think of that as electric to gas to electric, meaning that we will produce hydrogen on site. We will store the hydrogen and then we will put it into a fuel cell, which is turned back into electricity. And with the future deployment of those assets, we will be putting PICE on those as well to control both the BESS and the HESS, as well as to help maintain frequency and voltage. As we transition into Borrego 3.0, we are transitioning the island master. We have actually already transitioned the island master away from the diesel generators so that the microgrid is renewable based with our diesel as our backup source. Currently, the island master is our 1 megawatt, 3 megawatt hour battery, but in the future, it will be our 7.3 megawatt hour battery. And so you can see a picture of the microgrid yard over there on the right. And then if we could go to the next slide, please. At this point, I will transition into SDG&E's evaluation of the 4-pillar methodology. So if you transition to the next slide, we can start with pillar 1. So the most important thing when you're thinking about mitigation methods, and especially when you're thinking about a microgrid, is to define your geographical area of study, or in our instance, our microgrid boundary. So we kind of have what we would call 2 boundaries, but one is a subset. So circuit 2 is SDG&E's priority load, and that serves approximately 1,200 customers. And that would be served if we're concerned about, the mix of generation and load, and we need to load shed. We would drop circuits 1 and 3 and only provide priority to circuit 2. The reason we've identified circuit 2 as our priority is because it does have multiple gas stations. It has local restaurants and grocery stores. It has the cool zone with the library, and it also has the fire station. And it also has some customers that are currently on life support. But the full microgrid boundary, which came out of Borrego 2.0, was the additions of circuits 1 and 3, as well as circuit 2. And that serves the entire community of Borrego, which is roughly 2,800 customers. Now, the unique nature of Borrego is that it has a average household income of under 70,000 with a poverty rate of just under 7%. And the average age of the customers in our community is just above 62. So it is a very much an aging community. It's also, as I said, impacted by high heat. So it's really essential that we are able to provide this resiliency when the transmission line is down. So as we start to move into number 2 for pillar 1, we define the critical, the priority, and the discretionary load, and that was identified by SDG&E, but again, with support from our community. And that's why circuit 2 is our priority load, because of, those gas stations, those restaurants, those grocery stores, just, like a hub for the community if needed. And of circuit 2, it provides roughly 50% of critical load, and that would be during SDG&E's traditional microgrid operating season, which is the fall peak load. And then we have 15% of priority and about 35% of discretionary. As you transition to circuits 1 and 2, they represent 30% of critical load and 70% of discretionary for circuit 1, while circuit 3 has 40% of critical, 1% of priority, and 59% of discretionary. You can go to the next slide, please. As we continue on pillar 1, we have item number 3, which is to identify the resiliency targets within our load tiers. And as I said, there are basically 2 quote unquote microgrid boundaries. There's circuit 2. But if we were to serve the community through circuit 2 only, we could provide indefinite coverage in the fall season. The longest historical outage for circuit 2 was 20 hours in 2013. And as we transition down to number 3, this is a little bit of a repeat of the last slide, but it is just looking at what are the actual meters that fall into the critical, priority, and discretionary load. And then again, on the right, you can kind of see the percentage of the load as defined by megawatts that fall into critical, priority, and discretionary. So for circuit 2, we just have a couple of critical facilities with our fire station and our cool zone with our library. We have the fire station, which is obviously an emergency service. And we also have a couple of critical infrastructures like the local water utilities, control center, and some equipment, as well as telecommunications. Now, under most instances, SDG&E provides support to the whole community, which is circuits 1, 2, and 3. When we bring in all 3 circuits, we estimate that we can support the community for 12 hours of continuous support in the fall season. And the longest historical outage was this year for 12 hours. And you can see the breakout of the critical meters, the priority, and the discretionary, with the bottom chart being the total split between critical, priority, and discretionary for all 3 circuits combined. So critical represents 40% of the community's load, priority represents only 5%, and discretionary is 55%. When we add in circuits 1 and 3, we are able to pick up the sheriff's department as a critical facility, as well as an emergency service. And we are able to pick up some of our essential services like our medical clinic. Again, that is not a hospital. It's just a daytime operated medical clinic, as well as our 2 medical evacuation helipads. Since there is no local hospital, we do have to medically evac people in certain instances, or the community does. And then we just have our priority facilities. As we move down to number 4, we look to define the hazards in Borrego. So we identified 4 hazards. We have high wind. The probability of high wind is highly likely. It can cause unplanned outages, but historically it has not been the major reason that the Borrego Springs community has had electrical outages. Our second hazard would be lightning. It is also highly likely and can cause unplanned outages and has been the historical majority of the reasons why the community has lost power. Now, less frequently is heavy rains or flood damage, but it has caused an unplanned outage in the past, but it is not a majority of the historical outages. Now, very unique to Borrego Springs is the fact that it is served by that single radial transmission line, which is also goes through routine maintenance, which brings the whole community down. And so we do see our single source transmission line as a hazard for this community only, because unlike the rest of SDG&E service territory, they do not have a secondary transmission line that can feed them. They back up against IID service territory, so they do not have another interconnection with SDG&E. And historically, SDG&E actually has supported the community most frequently during transmission planned or unplanned outages. So that is one of our major hazards. As we looked to conduct our resiliency assessment under number 5, we utilized Borrego Springs specific SAIDI, SAFE, and CAIDI, so our system average interruption duration index. And we evaluated these metrics against our 2013 instance where we had the, or it was Borrego 1.0, and we only were able to support the community through our priority circuit of number 2. And you can tell that they had some significant interruptions in terms of minutes. They also had a significant number of interruptions in terms of frequency, which would be the SAFE number, the system average interruption frequency index. And then as you evaluate it for the customers, you can see in the last graph under CAIDI, the customer average interruption duration index, that 2013 was very significant for the community. And that was after the 2013 instances, that was the reason that SDG&E was looking to enter into Borrego 2.0 and the future Borrego 3.0, because we did see that there was a much more, there's more need in the Borrego Springs community than just providing support to Circuit 2. So as you can tell, we actually interconnected all 3 circuits into the community back in 2015, but starting in 2019, which is more when Borrego 2.0 had wrapped up completely, we see that the SAIDI, SAFE, and CAIDI numbers have started to come down. There was a jump in 2021, but that was, you know, a unique year, and we did also try to support the community through the microgrid. Next slide, please. Now, as we complete the pillar 1, we look at what is our resilience assessment. So the resilient deficit for the community is the inability to provide service under the N-1 transmission contingency. There's also, as I said, harsh weather in the region that makes it even more important that we support these communities in planned or unplanned outages. They also have above ground poles, which makes the community susceptible to this adverse weather more so than if it was underground. As we look to number B, which is our resilience priority for SDG&E, we want to decrease the customer impact from outages. And that includes both frequency as well as the duration of outages. And so through that, SDG&E sees a priority to be running the microgrid. Our first priority is always to the entire community, meaning all 3 circuits. And if needed, because of load and generation conditions, we would drop non-priority load and prioritize circuit 2 only. And then an important priority for SDG&E, both currently as well as in the future with the addition of our 2 new assets in the microgrid yard, is effectively balancing load and generation. We've seen a significant growth in PV, which makes the operation of the Borrego Springs microgrid even more complicated than it was in the past, and more complicated than potentially other microgrid operations that SDG&E does today. As we look to the last assessment, it's the resiliency metrics that we use to assess the mitigation impacts. So SDG&E on the last slide compared the Katie Safety Katie of Borrego 1.0, and we want to do that for later versions of Borrego Springs. Another important part is community engagement and satisfaction. That includes the social economics of the aging and vulnerable community. That includes their access to basic needs like food. The community, because it's surrounded by the state parks, it's a full hour to what you would call, quote unquote, a full service town. So that would be a full hour to find a Costco, a full hour to a hospital. And so for the community, one of the major things that we've heard is that customers have multiple refrigerators in order to store food for longer. So if they lose their power for too long, all that food spoils. So it's actually really important for us to provide those customers with the support that they deserve. Next slide, please. Okay, at this point, we've entered Pillar 2, and we're looking at the mitigation measures and assessing them. So as we start to go down, I have a planned outage versus an unplanned outage because they're very unique and they're very different. So when you think of startup or islanding transition, if it's a planned outage that SDG&E has, say for transmission pole maintenance, we're able to transition those customers in less than a minute. If it's an unplanned outage, SDG&E needs to evaluate A, what took the community down, and B, is it safe to energize? And the other aspect is we need to get some boots on the ground out to Borrego, which is, again, at the edge of our service territory. It's not that close to San Diego, and so it takes time for us to also deploy our crews out to Borrego Springs. And so in an unplanned outage, we have told the community that we will have power back up in 4.5 hours. So as you think about notification time, when you think about a planned outage, we actually want 10 to 14 days to develop a switch plan because there's multiple groups within SDG&E that are involved with the microgrid operation. And again, in an unplanned outage, we have told the community that we would have power back up in 4.5 hours. As stated before, the duration of backup depends on whether we are prioritizing circuit 2, in which case we would provide indefinite coverage. But if we were to provide SDG&E's first goal, which is support to the whole communities, it would be for 12 hours of microgrid islanding support. And then if you look at the load capacity, assuming October load, which is the typical time that SDG&E supports the community with the microgrid, the circuit 2 peak load is 2.8 megawatts, while the average peak load for circuits 1 through 3 would be 8.2 megawatts. Now, as you think about actually islanding and supporting the community, you need to think about the fuel types that exist in the microgrid. So we have our 2 diesel generators, which have 1,200 gallons of diesel available to store. If this is a planned outage, SDG&E will have a set delivery schedule with our diesel providers. And I say providers because SDG&E works with multiple providers in order to diversify our supply. And so we would have scheduled deliveries during a planned outage in order to help maintain the community. We have our existing and future battery storage, which are what we would call a closed loop, meaning that they could charge from the microgrid during islanding events from the solar that is coming from our customers. And then we also have the hydrogen, which would be a closed loop because it too could operate the electrolyzer during islanding event using the solar from our customers as well. Now for emissions level for our 2 diesel generators, they have 50 ppms of NOx limit per unit. And then in terms of the geographical boundaries on circuit 2, we have 1,188 meters, while circuits 1, 2, and 3 are 2,798 meters. And then if you look at the map on the right, you can get a better understanding of where the circuits and the support come from. So in the orange on the northern portion of Borrego Springs would be circuit 1. In the middle or a little bit west on the map would be circuit 2 in green, and that would be our priority load. The downtown area of Borrego is called Christmas Circle, so that's what we try to energize. It's kind of like a community hub. And then in the lower section of the community, you have circuit 3 in blue, and that would be the circuit that comes in and out of Borrego as well. Next slide, please. Now, continuing with Pillar 2, it's important to determine what mitigation measures exist to support the resiliency need for the community. So Borrego Springs is very unique because it sits at the edge of our service territory and is served by 1 transmission line. So there's really only 2 solutions. There is the Borrego Springs microgrid, and that's A. And then there is the potential for a second transmission line, and that would be B. Now, the important thing to understand about this theoretical second transmission line is that in order for it to truly be resilient, it would need to come from the opposite direction of our existing transmission line. So our existing transmission line comes from San Diego through multiple state parks in from the western side of Borrego Springs. And so in order to actually create resiliency for the community, we would need a second transmission line to come in from the eastern portion of the community, which would be interconnected with IID or Imperial Irrigation District. And so there's a couple of very unique aspects that would go into such a transmission line. For instance, the community, as I said, is completely surrounded by state parks. And so that is the same, that would be the same for if SDG&E was to propose a second transmission line to serve this community. It would traverse through state parks. It would also traverse a scenic highway. And so through SDG&E's evaluation of that mitigation measure, it was identified that a significant portion of the transmission line would need to be underground in order to actually transverse through state parks and be going along a scenic highway, because the last thing you want to see is the overhead. Now, another important thing to think about with such a transmission line is There's a long lead time. We would estimate at least 7 to 10 years, and that's assuming we could get the permitting and the right of way to actually build a transmission line through state parks and actually get IID to allow us to interconnect to one of their substations. So as you look at the two mitigation measures between Borrego Springs microgrid or the second transmission line, SDG&E ranks our microgrid higher because it can provide A, resiliency today, and B, it's a lower cost solution. So I've broken out the cost share that exists for the Borrego Springs microgrid. So SDG&E has put in roughly, or will put in roughly 40 million in capital. The DOE has given us multiple grants, and so they represent 8.9 million. The CEC has given us multiple grants, and they represent 7.5 million. And then we estimate that the O&M for the Borrego Springs microgrid is roughly 400,000 a year. Now, if you think about that big transmission line and the need to underground everything, you have to assume it's going to be a larger capital expenditure. And so we estimate that the CapEx will be above 450 million. And again, that's a long lead time solution. And then average O&M would be about 25,000 a year. Next slide, please. Now for SDG&E, Pillar 3 and Pillar 4 would be our resiliency scorecard, because it's important that we see how SDG&E has scored through the multiple iterations of Borrego Springs. So the first column would be SDG&E score for Borrego 1.0. The second column would be SDG&E score for Borrego 2.0, which the major difference between Borrego 1.0 and Borrego 2.0 would be the addition of all of the load within the community. So that would be circuits 1, 2, and 3 versus Borrego 1.0 only provided support to circuit 2. And then as we transition to the second to last column, we have Borrego 3.0. Now the major differences between Borrego 2.0 and Borrego 3.0, because the load is the same, is that A, Island Master was taken away from the diesel generator so that it could be a renewable microgrid. And B, we were able to contemplate remote operation of the microgrid, which helps to improve, response time and the need for support from our crews to operate the microgrid. And then in the last column, we look at Borrego 3.0 if you were only to support the priority load of circuit 2. So as you can see, under Borrego 1.0, we did score high in terms of the duration of backup. We got a 6 because we can provide indefinite support with just circuit 2. But we're not providing as much of the capacity for the critical load. And so we scored only a 7 in terms of load capacity. And we also only scored a 1 in terms of load capacity for discretionary load. Now, as you transition to Borrego 2.0, we have to give up some duration in order to support the whole community, but you're able to pick up more of your critical and discretionary load than you were under Borrego 1.0. So while your score for duration drops to a 2, you jump up to a 9 for critical load support and up to 3 for discretionary load support. And then the same would be true for Borrego 3.0, because again, it's the only difference is later in the scorecard. And Borrego 3.0 under priority circuit is similar to Borrego 1.0. So ironically, they all score a 20, but it's more in where they score the numbers that are different on this portion of the scorecard. So for SDG&E, this is pillar 3 and 4, because we're not only doing, typically pillar 3 would be your resiliency scorecard under your first iteration, and then pillar 4 would be doing this scorecard through future iterations, which is why we have the last 3 columns. Can we transition to the next one? Thanks. Now, as we continue through the scorecard, we look at the fuel availability. And for Borrego 1, 2, and 3.0, it's actually been very similar, because even back in Borrego 1.0, we had diesel generators, but we also had a battery. So we had on-site intermittent, we had on-site produced, we had wired infrastructure, and we had transport with our diesel. And that has continued in the future with our other versions of Borrego. So we didn't score any differently in the fuel availability section, even though we've been adding assets. It just doesn't show through the score. Where we do get some more scoring is in the emissions level. So under Borrego 1.0, we have partial non-GHG emitting resources. So that would be our battery. But we also have our diesel generators that meet the CARB emission standards or local air standards. And that continued for Borrego 2.0. But what SDG&E changed or scored differently for Borrego 3.0 on both all circuits and circuit 2 only is we have non-GHG emitting. And the reason we scored that is because we changed Island Master away from the diesel generators to the battery. And so we're able to only utilize the diesel generators in an as needed situation. And so we scored ourselves higher under our future iteration as a renewable microgrid. Excellent. Now, as we continue into the scorecard, we look at the startup time for the microgrid. And under Borrego 1.0, it was entirely manual, literally people in the field sectionalizing. And so it scored very low in the startup time for the microgrid. We put ourselves at above 2 hours, so that gave us a 1. That also made our notification time more than 120 hours. I would also say that SDG&E interprets notification time to be an unplanned outage, in which case we score ourselves a 1 across the board, because we're never going to transition into island mode until we have determined that it is safe to do so. As we finish off the blue sky services for Borrego 1.0, the only thing we really scored was being able to maintain voltage and frequency. Under Borrego 2.0, we introduced a microgrid controller, which allowed us to have seamless transition. So we were able to score ourselves as a 5 in startup, but we didn't add any services to blue sky mode. Now with Borrego 3.0, we once again score as a 5 for 0 to 1 transition time. The only thing I would say is that we can also transition in a planned outage remotely, which we never could do before. And then the one change to Borrego 3.0, both under all circuits and circuit 2, is that we are going to put that 7.3 megawatt 7.3 megawatt battery into the CAISO marketplace in order to offset the capital cost to our ratepayers. And so we've given ourselves a 2 for wholesale participation, because it does help to lower the cost to our ratepayers. So as you take in all of the prior 2 scorecards with this one, Borrego 1.0 scored a 37 altogether. Borrego 2.0 scored a 41, and Borrego 3.0 was able to score a 47. And we assume that the total possible points is 60. Next slide. Now, as we continue through Pillar 4, we look at what we have achieved with our resiliency targets. And so for SDG&E, we're able to review Borrego 1, 2, and 3.0 against each other, or just simply lay out what has changed for the microgrid. So the biggest difference between 1 and 2 is the geographical area that it supports. So once again, you know, Borrego 1.0 was just one circuit, so it's just under 1,200 meters, while Borrego 2 and 3 are the whole community, so almost all 2,800 meters. There's also been a significant change in the resources that exist for the microgrid. We have Borrego 1.0 just being our 2 diesel generators and our initial small 0.5 megawatt hour battery. In 2.0, we were able to add, you know, another battery at 1 megawatt. We were able to add a 3 megawatt hour load bank to help with the excess solar that exists. And then in Borrego 3.0, we will add the 7.3 megawatt hour battery, the 1/4 megawatt hour hydrogen energy storage system, and we also added the ultra capacitor. Now, for SDG&E, one of the main differences between Borrego 1, 2, and 3.0 actually comes in microgrid operation. So Borrego 1.0 was a very manual microgrid operation process. It meant it needed a significant amount of SDG&E employee support. Borrego 2.0 still needs that on the field support, but we do have a controller that is able to manually control the generators and the diesel in the microgrid yard. Now, as we transition to Borrego 3.0, we're looking forward to utilizing our PICE controller. And as part of Borrego 3.0, SDG&E has a DOE grant in order to model and simulate how all of these resources listed above will work together to actually island and maintain load, to black start the community using the battery as an island master. And so the microgrid controller has remote capabilities for the first time ever. And then there's just been, through SDG&E's different grants that we've received for the Borrego Springs microgrid, there's been different goals for what the microgrid is trying to accomplish. So back in Borrego 1.0, that would have been our DOE grant. Back in Borrego 2.0, that would have been our CEC grant. Basically, we just wanted to try to increase resiliency by adding more customers, you know, decrease outage response time. And then as we look to Borrego 3.0, we want to be able to operate the microgrid under a renewable microgrid. We want to transition away from diesel and use inverter batteries as island master. And we want to model more so we can understand how the microgrid is actually going to respond. And then the next row is just a simple repeat of the load capacity that I've stated before. And the second to last row is the microgrid island duration under each iteration. And then finally, you have the capital costs that came out of each iteration. So the first Borrego 1.0 was a contribution from SDG&E, the DOE, and the CEC. Borrego 2.0 was strictly SDG&E and the CEC grant. And then Borrego 3.0 is SDG&E and our DOE grant with NREL. Next slide. Now, an important part of Pillar 4, and not only just for the 4-pillar methodology, but for SDG&E, is lessons learned. And there have been a significant amount of lessons learned for the Borrego Springs microgrid. Number one, nascent technology. It's SDG&E's experience that there is no off-the-shelf solution for a microgrid. Every single microgrid has to be customized. And that's because the load and the generation are all going to be so different. So is the microgrid boundary area. And so this has been one of our major areas of growth. There's also significant interoperable communication capabilities between the different microgrid components. So that's why for SDG&E, our PICE controller is a significant step forward, because it allows us to operate these various resources together as one more effectively. Number 2 for SDG&E has been dynamic system modeling. We have found that it is really important to model in a lab setting using real-time digital simulators that we have in our lab, how the microgrid will act under any various scenarios. Anytime we add a new asset, we go to our lab and we input the specifications that we received from the resource manufacturer to model how it will react with the existing resources that exist at the Borrego Springs microgrid, with the load that we've seen. And so this has been a really essential part of SDG&E's operation of the microgrid, and why we went after the current DOE grant. And it's allowed us to analyze power quality data and just find where there could be failures or troubleshooting issues in the future so that we can avoid them in actual island operation. As we transition down to number 3, we look at energy storage specifications and standards. There has been a significant development, and there's been significant evolving of technologies, which makes, again, the interoperability between those resources very unique and very different, and sometimes is a challenge. We have been trying to build a microgrid in tandem with those specifications and standards. And an important part for SDG&E has been actually documenting what has happened in order to use those lessons learned in the future, because we know that it's not going to be the same crew tomorrow that necessarily supported the microgrid today. So having those lessons learned and those standards written down by SDG&E for someone to use in the future is really essential. And then number 4 is operational coordination. It's really essential for SDG&E to have local community engagement. So when SDG&E is planning a planned outage, so for instance, the transmission line has to have some poles replaced, we will utilize social media and the local newspaper to notify customers that there will be an islanding event. And then there's just cross-functional activities between SDG&E, and it's important that we stay up to date on pertinent rules and regulations. And so that's been really important for operational coordination. And then, like anyone today, cyber and physical security is really important. So just clearly labeling what things are so people are safe around our microgrid or operating within our microgrid for SDG&E's own crew. Final slide. And then as we look towards Pillar 4, we look towards what are areas to explore within the 4 pillars methodology itself, and not just SDG&E's operation of Borrego Springs. So the first half is 4 pillars for SDG&E specific. So for SDG&E, we modified the scorecard to account for lower GHG emissions for subsequent updates to the microgrid, meaning taking the diesel generators from the island master and putting them into the battery. That lowered our GHG emissions, and we think that was really important to score that and to show that through the scorecard. There could be the potential that the scorecard could benefit from personnel requirements, meaning that there are less demands on our crews in subsequent iterations of Borrego Springs than there have been in the past. So that could be a way to further develop the 4 pillars methodology. There's clearly an impact for SDG&E of the impact of duration capabilities from using those renewable generations versus those fossil fuel. And that was shown through our first scorecard when you could compare Borrego 1.0 to Borrego 3.0. because we took the diesel generator away from Island Master, or because we added all of the circuits instead of just priority load 2, that really changed the scorecard for us. And that was very unique. And then there's just the comparative analysis of performance versus goals. For SDG&E, it's been more important to just learn as we go with our microgrid. And so there might not be necessarily set goals, but there's been operational lessons learned that have really allowed us to make our mitigation measure, our resiliency in the community more impactful. And then finally, SDG&E evaluated areas to explore for the entire 4 pillars methodology, maybe not just unique to SDG&E. And so the first one would be, it's customized for each use case. And not all steps will be applicable to each mitigation solution. So there is some uniqueness that comes with the methodology. The second one that we identified is that there were times where a more detailed description of each step or a template to follow would have been really beneficial. And I say that because our presentation was developed with significant input from Energy Division. And not everyone that's going to go through the 4 pillars in the future is going to have that one-on-one support to develop their 4 pillars methodology. And so there could be the use for a more descriptive template in the future for the 4 pillars methodology. And then there could be some benefits from the scorecard having further refinement, like some of the recommendations that SDG&E found for themselves, whether it's lower GHG emissions from future microgrid updates, or the requirement for less personnel on site with future iterations as well. And there might be other ones that their next presenter might have found were beneficial to add to their scorecard. And so it's important that there's stakeholder involvement to further refine the scorecard. And with that, that's the end of my presentation.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Stacy, for that wonderful presentation. We'll now transition into a Q&A session. Roseanne, if you could go to the next slide, just so every folks can see the Q&A logistics. Anyway, so for folks who want to ask a question verbally, please go ahead and raise your hand and I can unmute you. I see we have a few questions within the written Q&A that perhaps we can turn to in just a moment. I do want to turn to our panelists and hosts here and see if there are any questions. If there are any questions from the panelists that we want to touch on before we go to audience Q&A. And I'll also pause the recording.
All right, can you hear me okay?
We can hear you fine.
Okay, great. Thanks, Julian. So hi, everyone. My name is Demetra Zamaris, and I'm a senior manager in distributed energy resources at the Center for Sustainable Energy. I'm joined today by David Liebman, the Energy and Sustainability Manager from the Sonoma County Junior College District. And over the past few years, we've worked together on a campus microgrid demonstration project at the Santa Rosa Junior College. And we'll be talking about the SRJC microgrid project today and explore how its integrated concepts provided in the 4-pillar methodology, both intentionally and organically through the life of the project. So thank you for joining us today for this discussion. Next slide, please. First, I'd like to quickly introduce my organization, the Center for Sustainable Energy, or CSE for short. We're a mission-driven nonprofit organization headquartered in San Diego, but with programs and employees located across the nation. CSE is known for its data-driven approach and customer focus. We administer EV, EVI, and renewable energy incentive programs. And on the SRJC microgrid project, CSE helped with project management and measurement and evaluation activities. Next slide, please. And also want to briefly introduce the Santa Rosa Junior College. So Santa Rosa Junior College is a part of the Sonoma County Junior College District, who was the prime grant recipient for this project, which is a California Energy Commission EPIC funded project. Santa Rosa Junior College was founded in 1918. It's located in Sonoma County, and it's committed to creating a culture of sustainability. And as I mentioned in our initial introductions on that very first slide, my co-presenter, David Liebman, is the Energy and Sustainability Manager for Sonoma County Junior College District and represents the Santa Rosa Junior College. Next slide, please. So this slide provides a brief overview of what we plan to cover in our presentation, introductions, which we just covered, and then next we'll provide some context around the SRJC microgrid project, including the motivating factors that inspired this demonstration project, and some details about the microgrid itself. We're also going to cover how our project first came into contact with the 4 pillars methodology, and then how we began to actively incorporate the 4 pillars methodology into the project, starting at pillar 3, and then kind of in hindsight, looking at how we've already kind of worked in the 4 pillar methodology concepts throughout the life of the program. And it's at that point, I'll hand it over to David to discuss how the 4 pillar methodology concepts are really intertwined in a lot of the climate mitigation and adaptation planning efforts on the SRJC campus, and also how the college district plans to incorporate the 4 pillars methodology in the future. So we'll be holding aside a half hour at the end to allow for open questions and discussion. Next slide, please. So I've hit on a lot of these goals already, but these are the main topics that we hope to cover in this portion of the workshop. So you should walk away from this presentation with an understanding of the Santa Rosa microgrid demonstration project, how it incorporated the aspects of the 4 pillar methodology, and how resiliency planning can tie into a site's broader environmental and economic goals. Next slide, please. So this slide shows a screenshot from the CAL FIRE map illustrating all of the 2017 wildfire incidents and their impact. I really like kind of sharing some of these screen grabs from CAL FIRE because it level sets what the community, the Santa Rosa community has experienced, and what really drove the development and then the implementation of this demonstration project. So the wildfire impact, especially the events of 2017, heavily impacted the Santa Rosa Junior College. The college is located adjacent to a Tier 3 high fire threat district, disadvantaged communities, and also regions that are heavily impacted by public safety power shutoffs. So the Santa Rosa Junior College and its microgrid stand to serve as a crucial resiliency hub in the face of a natural disaster such as the wildfire. Next slide, please. So this table here is also pulled from CAL FIRE. It shows the top 20 most destructive California wildfires. And in blue, I've highlighted all of the wildfires that have occurred since 2017. So you can see that's a lot of the fires that are listed on this table. It's over half, so 13 out of 20 to be exact, have occurred within the past 6 years. So this is an increasing issue, and it's not one that's going to go away. And it's, you know, a big risk for the Santa Rosa Junior College. Next slide. And so this just narrows down on the list. So the 2 fires that are highlighted here are the ones that really drove this demonstration project. So 2 out of the top 20 most destructive wildfires impacted the Santa Rosa community. So the Tubbs fire, which is that second fire listed in 2017, was pretty destructive, and while the campus itself didn't have any damage, a lot of the students and the faculty from the junior college were directly impacted by this fire and lost their homes. So it really ties into the fact that, you know, the campus microgrid is hoping to be able to serve that really important community resource in an event like this in the future. Next slide. So just wanted to give an overview of how the microgrid is configured, and then also what the goals of this microgrid project were. I'm not going to go into too much detail. I feel like we could have a presentation in itself about the microgrid project, but happy to answer any questions that come up towards the end. So the Santa Rosa microgrid consists of 4 solar PV arrays, which is 1 rooftop solar system and then 3 carport solar systems, which are estimated to generate collectively 3,600 megawatt hours of AC per year. And that calculation was done via PV watts. And then there's 3 batteries that are part of the microgrid. So it's 2 power batteries with 1 megawatt, 1 megawatt hour capacity each. And then 1 what we call energy battery with the 1 megawatt, 2 megawatt hours of capacity. So it's a solar and a battery microgrid, and it's supporting over 20 campus buildings. And it also includes load shedding devices at the building level to allow flexibility across the campus. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on how loads were prioritized, but it does, like I said, give the campus microgrid some flexibility on what buildings will stay online during an outage if it is an extended outage. So based on modeling and design of the microgrid can support the full campus through nearly 3-hour outage, but the load shedding devices can help extend that time and provide a capacity to still support critical loads. Beyond the resiliency goal, there was also environmental and economic goals that were set out by the college with this project. The environmental goal was to support 40% of the campus's electricity use with the solar generation during regular operating scenarios. And then also during an outage, the solar and battery is intended to offset the use of diesel generators that the campus had currently on site. On the economic side, there is a goal during blue sky operating for the microgrid to reduce peak demand to avoid demand charges. And then also the microgrid will be participating in utility demand response programs, which will be an additional value stream to the campus. Also on the slide here, I included energy efficiency. So this wasn't something that was necessarily directly included within the scope of the CEC grant, but it is something that the college really prioritizes and has been taking into consideration in conjunction with the development of the microgrid. So they've been doing a number of energy efficiency measures across the buildings on campus in order to reduce the campus load and to ensure that the microgrid will be able to support the campus load for longer if the load is a little bit lower. So David will discuss this a little bit later in his portion of the presentation as well. Next slide, please. So you might be wondering, how does any of this relate to the CPUC microgrid proceeding or the 4 pillars of the resiliency methodology? And as I mentioned, our project kind of came across this a little bit later into the project. So this project is a 4-year grant project. It started in early 2019, and we started to engage with the microgrid proceeding in the 4 pillars methodology closer to 2021 timeframe. And so, as a demonstration project, we were looking for opportunities to share lessons learned that could help inform future microgrid projects at other campuses. And we were really closely following the CPUC microgrid proceeding when it began. And one of the scope of work items that we had on our project was to develop a California-specific cost-benefit analysis that could characterize the various value streams of the microgrid. And we felt it was a really good opportunity to try to operationalize the scorecard and the resiliency metrics that are established in the 3rd pillar of the 4 pillars methodology. And so that's when we started to really incorporate the 4 pillars. And so we were taking some of those example scorecard metrics and including it directly into this tool that we were developing. And it led to the development of what we're now calling the Site Equity Resiliency Analysis tool. Next slide, please. So the Site Equity Resiliency Analysis tool, SARA for short, is a simple Excel-based tool that leverages the publicly available NREL REAP tool. And the intent was to serve as a guide to help other sustainability managers on similar facilities that are interested in potentially pursuing a microgrid project, but maybe not at the point where they want to fully invest in robust modeling or design, and they can walk through this publicly available tool and see what different project options exist for their site. And so it's really meant as a guide for the REOP tool when assessing a new project. So as I mentioned, the SARA tool itself is just a really basic Excel tool, and it pretty much gives step-by-step on how to use REOPT, as well as incorporating some new inputs as well. So here on the slide, it summarizes that there's essentially 3 different types of inputs that the tool uses. There's technical sizing inputs, which include utility consumption and facility type, and those get put directly into REOPT. But in addition to that, the SARA tool supplements the REOPT tool with some of these resiliency and equity-based inputs. So while REOPT does have some resiliency aspects with regard to assessing critical loads and load backup requirements, the SARA tool also looks at site vulnerability. And so that's essentially what risks are available in the surrounding community of the site that you're assessing. So it could be proximity to fault lines, flood zones, wildfire risk. And then it also looks at how important the facility is to the community. And then on the equity side of things, we are looking at more of the social impacts of an outage. And it looks at the different aspects such as like site location. So is your site located in a low-income community or DAC? And it also incorporates the surrounding community's energy burden as well in assessing a potential project. Next slide, please. And I also just want to note that we are running through this tool really quickly because there's just so much content for us to cover in this presentation. But we have been talking to the CPUCs. There might be a potential for us to kind of do a follow-up more specifically on this tool where we can get a little bit more into the weeds. But we just wanted to give you kind of a taste of the SARA tool in this presentation as like a reference point for how we became engaged with the 4 pillars methodology, since our case study is a little bit less direct than the one that you heard from SDG&E, since a lot of this we're looking at after the fact, and David will get into that. But really the goal of the SARA tool was to provide effective and actionable results to the user. And it was intended to kind of pair a standard cost-benefit analysis with equity and resiliency metrics to provide more of a holistic solution to the users. So these results are intended to lead to a more targeted conversations and allow the site manager, whoever is using this tool, to help provide direction for future exploration. So the technical and financial results all come directly out of the REOP tool. But these resiliency and equity metrics that you see on the screen are what's supplemented by the SARA tool. So based on the inputs we described on the previous slide, the SARA tool will yield a vulnerability score of 0 to 10 to kind of assess how high your vulnerability is on site to the various different impacts, like I said, for wildfires or flood risk, all those sorts of things. And then it also looks at the avoided loss during an outage, which is a pretty common metric at this point in time, but it's looking at how much revenue would be lost during an outage and how much you plan to have backed up by the system that you're looking at. And David will go a little bit more into that because this is something we looked pretty closely at with the microgrid in terms of the cost that you save by keeping the lights on and keeping students in class. But we were trying to kind of tie some of those more soft resiliency costs or soft resiliency impacts into a cost. And then on the equity side of things, we're looking really at the two kind of breakdowns: the social cost of carbon and the average energy burden. And so these are just ways to incorporate these kind of more social metrics when we're assessing the feasibility of a particular project. And so it was upon discussing this SARA tool and how we were planning to incorporate some of the ideas from the third pillar of the 4-pillar methodology into our tool, where we realized that a lot of the 4-pillar methodology was already kind of naturally integrated into the design and modeling and implementation process of the microgrid project. And so we really want to spend the bulk of this presentation reflecting back on that, going through the different pillars and looking at how that has kind of lived in the Santa Rosa microgrid project, and then also how now that we're more aware and engaged with the 4-pillar methodology, how this will continue to inform future planning both at Santa Rosa and the Sonoma Junior County District altogether. So I'm going to hand it over to David to go into more detail about how the 4-pillar methodology concepts are integrated into our project. Bye.
All right, thank you, Dima. Good morning, everyone. As Dima said, my name is David Lehman. I'm the Energy and Sustainability Manager for the Sonoma County Junior College District. As an additional plug to California Community Colleges, we are part of the California Community College system. We serve over 1.9 million students a year as a whole system. We are the largest educational system in the United States, the 3rd largest in the world, and we provide high quality education at little to no cost and serve really the most vulnerable members of our community. So I really see community colleges at the forefront of social equity and climate resiliency, and how climate change and resiliency have such an impact on the community we serve. We started really focusing on resiliency and adaptation actually back in 2014, when we really developed our first facilities master plan, which really mirrors our educational master plan as an institution. It's very common for colleges and universities to have an educational master plan and then a facilities master plan, which mirrors the facility needs and infrastructure needs to accomplish their educational mission. During the development of that plan, we became aware of a lot of climate adaptation data and began to play around with how do we integrate that data into our master plan, our building design, and our building specifications. So within the span from 2017 till now, the college and Sonoma County has experienced 4 major wildfires. And one of the years we didn't have a wildfire, back in 2018, the Russian River flooded, and it actually isolated our farm campus, which is located along the Russian River. So we see multiple impacts and how they impact our community and how they impact our infrastructure as a whole. Those impacts are wildfires, smoke, and smoke getting into our buildings through our HVAC systems, flooding, specifically flooding on a floodplain as well as the Russian River, extreme heat days and how that impacts not only the community, but our faculty and staff, the impact it has on our infrastructure assets, as well as our athletic components and our athletic students and coaches. And lastly, the increase in cooling degree days and how that is really changing the climate within Santa Rosa and Sonoma County, and how most of our buildings were developed at a time when we really didn't need cooling, and that is now changing. Next slide. So since we began this journey of resiliency and adaptation, we have focused on a number of resiliency and adaptation measures to be implemented. So we've really focused on utilizing CalAdapt data in the creation of our facilities master plan, as well as modifying our educational master plan. What that means is really looking at, we know wildfires and smokes are and unhealthy air from smoke is going to keep occurring. And so we might have to start planning for fire and smoke days in our academic calendar, where we plan that there will be days we will be closed because our students still need a certain number of hours of educational hours a year in order to achieve their credentials or their certifications. We've conducted a load prioritization planning and study that really looks at prioritizing our buildings, our services, and our loads. We've conducted analyses on our electrical feeders, accounting for not only future electrification, but the increased peak load demand from extreme heat days and increases in the number of cooling degree days, as well as accounting for the fact that there's a significant amount of energy efficiency that we can do to reduce the overall demand and usage on our electrical infrastructure. We have recently implemented wildfire smoke programming in our building management systems, where we will shut down our building management systems to not bring in outside air and then circulate their internal air through their filters to prevent wildfire smoke from going in. And lastly, really focus on new building specification standards that really guide architects and engineers how not to use past data, which is most of the data that folks use, but really use the Cal Adapt modeling and future data around adaptation and resiliency. And so what that looks like and what we have found is we've found there's a very strong gap in knowledge between taking the adaptation data that the state of California has and really applying it at the architectural and engineering level. And we've even found conflicts. So for example, when utilizing the modeling from CalAdapt for our main Santa Rosa campus, we can look at the increase in the number of days we'd have to cool our buildings by 2030 and 2050, and how we would then size our cooling equipment. Well, we have found that actually the Title 24 Part 6 Energy Pro modeling tool will actually penalize us if we oversize to that future projection. And so that's just one example of conflicts that we've found, as well as the gap in knowledge and how to utilize that data. Another example includes in how to use high intensity rainfall in stormwater infrastructure management to prevent flooding. Most of the data is always utilized not for flood protection. When it comes to stormwater infrastructure of civil engineers, it's mostly done for how to treat water on the first inch of rainfall to prevent it from going into creeks and rivers, which is important. But now we're seeing another need on how do you adapt and design stormwater infrastructure for the high intensity rainfall that's projected to occur in a short period of time. And lastly, really integrated our microgrid. Our microgrid has been up and running for about a year and a half with ongoing testing and measurement and verification, and really looking at how this measure is implemented to increase our resiliency and adaptation to a changing climate. Next slide. So our microgrid journey really began as a resiliency and adaptation measure for our energy systems, but we really wanted to focus on maximizing our sustainability and energy efficiency goals. So we really wanted to acknowledge as a project team that what is one of the main drivers of our needs for adaptation and resiliency is our overall greenhouse gas emissions that we are producing. And so our main number one goal with our microgrid is to really reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, then resiliency, which has become even more and more important, followed by cost savings. So as an adaptation and resiliency measure, the first step in our process was mapping out our electrical infrastructure, really looking at from meter to loads and building services. Our next step after mapping and finishing our mapping process was load prioritization. And then finally, once we prioritized our load, we went ahead and modeled what would our system sizing be, what would be the assets we would need to install, install design, come up with a complete design to cover our load prioritizations, and then begin to apply our first baseline assessment to that final design. And what that means is that really is we have a finished design. We know where we're going to put our assets. We know the loads we're going to cover. And then we go back and we say, okay, we are placing our battery storage in this location. What are the impacts of extreme heat days, flooding, high intensity rainfall in a short period of time, etc., in that asset where it's located? And that's really important so that we don't design something that is a measure for making us more resilient to our changing climate, and have one of those changing climate incidents knock out our infrastructure and make it move. Next slide. So load prioritization at junior college is a very, I'll say, fun process. As you can imagine, we are a public entity. We have a shared governance process where we work with our students, faculty, and staff. We also have environmental health and safety professionals. We have district police, first responders. And so we had to go through a very extensive process in prioritizing our loads, really from a facilities professional level through a shared governance process and ultimately up to our cabinet, who can then approve it, and then ultimately bring that to our governing board, our board of trustees, who can then approve our plan. And so our load prioritization process really began with identifying all of our existing emergency circuits and emergency power assets. We had multiple department meetings to discuss what are the impacts when we experience a 1 hour outage, a 2 hour outage, a 3 hour outage, and a 5-day outage, modeling a PSPS event. And so unlike other entities where the loss of load value can be easily correlated to a loss in production or a loss in revenue, as a public entity in a community college, our load prioritization and our loss of load value is significantly more complicated. And so we would have meetings with departments where we would know that, okay, this building has these assets. It's not too important if the building loses power, only then to find out that our life science building, which we didn't really prioritize, has a large tropical fish tank. And if the power goes out for more than 3 hours, the fish will die because the heater won't work. And then we are looking at a loss of an asset that we would have to replace that could cost anywhere from $10,000 to $15,000 to get rare tropical fish. We have examples where we have a health science building, and if there's an outage more than 2 hours, the programmed instructional nursing stations will lose their programming, and we have to hire a programmer to come from the East Coast to reprogram them and not only pay for the cost of their time, but the cost of their flight out here. And so it took a significant amount of effort and time to really methodically look at not only what facilities operations knows as its emergency circuits and emergency powers, but what are the assets that really departments and buildings lose when they lose power and over what time duration. And so our process really looked at, and our guiding process really looked at, as a public entity, our number one goal and top priority is operational continuance. So what do we need to run for basic services to continue? And I can tell you that's a data center so that we could operate remotely and have all of our student information data. The next is the check machine. All public employees need to get paid in order to work. Then we have our student financial services. If there's a natural disaster, we provide financial services to our students who don't have any resources. And so we need the ability to print them checks or send them money. And so after looking at those basic services to continue, we then look at, okay, we are now operational as a college. We can provide our basic services to run. Then we look at what are the next services that we provide before we can resume classes. And that can be now in today's age, classes remotely, or it could also be in person. And then lastly, once we achieve what we call academic continuance, where we have enough basic services and secondary services to resume academic teaching, what is the prioritization of our teaching spaces in our buildings, right? What buildings house the most classes, the most lab buildings that allow us to really serve the most students possible, which really comes down to English, math, and are really our number one highly used classes, followed by science labs. Next slide. So going through this process where we then conduct our load prioritization, as well as our hazard impacts, after we had completed our load prioritizations, we then were able to then look at those loads and those buildings and rank them. Followed by that ranking is then how we then looked at the load of those buildings in their ranking groups, and we're able to size and then design our solar and battery microgrid. One of the important things I brought up earlier was really looking at the hazard impacts on specific resiliency measures. So we really found that in a 5-day outage, our current lithium ion storage just really doesn't cut it for propping up our entire campus for a multi-day 5-day outage. We really need a long duration energy storage solution that can discharge for more than 10 hours. Due to the experience of the wildfires we had in Sonoma County at the time, we got real world data from our PV production on what actually was our drop in PV production because of the smoke in the air. And then we then proceeded to then model our design system on to see how much more solar or how much more storage we would need to account for a resiliency outage event during a wildfire where there's smoke in the air. We look at how flooding would impact the physical electrical assets, and then how will the extreme heat days impact our peak load, as well as the electrical equipment and what it was rated for. Next slide. So here you can see kind of an overview of our campus feeders. So we tie directly into PG&E substation feeder line number 7 at 12,000 volts. From there, we then have our own 12 kV feeder infrastructure that goes around our campus. Our microgrid in an island event becomes our 12 kV feeder grid. And we have 25 buildings on this grid that we are serving. I will say during the load prioritization process, that is an ongoing iteration. We, in the span of designing and implementing this project, the college pursued building student housing, and we now have a 365 bed, 24/7 student housing complex connected to our microgrid. And so we see the need to continually adapt and improve our ranking and our load prioritization as things just come out of the blue and our spaces change. So by utilizing our spaces and the load prioritization, there were some really interesting concepts that had come up. So we saw a significant advantage of load prioritization in our future capital planning. We found that we had multiple buildings that we had ranked priority 1 because of the services they provided for us to continue as an organization. And that led to conversations about why can't all those services be merged and those departments moved into one building. That way we only have one building that houses all of our tier one services. We've also looked at, through our prioritization and space utilization process, how our building spaces change. And it was really through that process that we determined that we couldn't design and build our microgrid that was really hardwired to emergency circuits at every single building, because it didn't give us flexibility. And so as part of our microgrid design and build out, every single one of our buildings has a load shed disconnect that allows us to disconnect the building from the grid. And then those buildings are grouped together in the load prioritization ranking. And this allows us to also change the ranking in the where those buildings lie in the grouping based on when departments move or spaces change. Next slide. So right here is just a quick single line example of really mapping out your electrical assets and grids and buildings. And then the only thing I would like to point out here is really that we also ranked our buildings within our one line diagram. So again, ranking that load prioritization per building and building services allows us to really get a large view of our campus and how we prioritize our loads. Next slide. So after going through our load prioritization, we really decided that we needed to utilize modeling software in order to create our value of resiliency and really conduct an advanced techno-economic model. And so we needed to model what are the values that we need to put on building functions and building services. We needed to create a loss of load values for our buildings, right? If the campus goes down, if we have to load shed groups of our buildings, what is the loss of load value? Being a 100% renewable energy only microgrid, we had to model on the technology side, you know, what battery state of charge must be maintained for daily charging and running of prioritized loads on a daily basis per each day out of the month, out of the year. And then lastly, really look at what is the value of energy efficiency, especially passive design energy efficiency, and how it increases our resiliency in relation to the technology that we deploy. Next slide. So what the college did in order to create a loss of load value is we looked at what is our annual general fund, how is that broken up by the number of students that we serve per class and per, you know, sitting in the class, what are the building services within that building, what are the loss of values in that specific building, and then what values and services need to be powered before students can return and sit in their seats and get through class. And so we used a value called WISH, which stands for Weekly Student Headcount. And it's a value of space utilization that community colleges use in reporting back to the state of California. And that really allowed us to look at our utilization with respect to the spaces that serve our students, classes, and labs. And we were able to take that value to look at how well utilized our buildings are in terms of the number of students they serve, and then begin to build out the building type, the additional assets that we would lose if we lost power. And we really could only do this complicated process and information gathering to get a value that really reflects what happens when a community college public entity loses power for long periods of time, and utilize a modeling software to do that. Next slide. So the modeling tool we used is called Zendy. It is built on Lawrence Berkeley National Labs DeerCam tool. And the Zendy tool utilizes what's called date types. It utilizes hourly resolution based off of the average weekday of a month, the average weekend of a month, and the average peak day of that month, and does that for every month out of the year on an hourly resolution. It's important to note that the modeling software really gives us the flexibility to test out different technologies and their economic results and optimization. But I will caution that it's really important that you then integrate the model with whichever microgrid controller, which controls all your assets, whatever engine that controller has, because otherwise you might be left in a situation where you modeled something, but then your actual controllability asset will not operate the same way. Next slide. And so one of the main purposes of modeling and going into the different mitigation measures is it really allows us to look at what are the optimal technology sizing for our goals for our microgrid. So this slide really just shows what is the optimal storage sizing for a 3-hour outage if we don't allow any of our buildings to load shed for that given month. It also, we can look at allowing for what is the optimal storage sizing if we allow buildings to load shed, and it allows us to look at multiple mitigation options and multiple costs and operational metrics. Next slide. So here we can then see the actual resiliency dispatch. So again, the value of utilizing an advanced modeling tool as part of the mitigation measures was that not only could it give us a list of cost and different types of technologies and sizing, we can then model it to see how would it actually operate in a multi-day outage event. So what this slide shows us is the first day of a 5-day outage and what is the generation and storage sizing we would need if we allow all of our load priority 2 through 5 buildings to load shed and just serve our load priority 1 buildings in a 5-day outage. And the model said that we need 5.6 megawatt hours worth of capacity in order to survive a 5-day outage event, just serving load priority 1 buildings. Next slide. And so again, here we could actually utilize the model to then find interesting questions that we can then propose to our utility. So we found that when looking at a 3-hour outage event where we don't allow for any curtailment, right after the event, we would then be hit with a significant amount of demand charges to our bill because we would have utilized all of our battery storage for the outage. And so we then pose the question to our utility PG&E, is there a grace period or are we going to be hit with demand charges? And these are questions that we really wouldn't have been able to ask unless we went through this modeling effort. One of my favorite finds from this modeling effort was, since the modeling software we use really focuses on can focus on cost optimization, we found that the modeling results kept telling us that we should load shed a number of our buildings because at that hour, at that month out of the year, the demand charge potential would be higher than keeping those buildings with students in them live. And so we actually had to go back into the model and force a value that allowed the model to see, oh, the value of keeping the power to this building that's serving students is more valuable for that hour than the potential demand charge. And so that was really fascinating results to find, and extremely valuable in us understanding, well, no, we know that keeping students in class for that hour or hours is more valuable than the demand charge the college would experience. So therefore, our value of resiliency at a minimum needs to be higher for that hour than what the demand charge is. And so that really began shaping our conversations of what is our internal value of resiliency as an organization. Next slide. Here we can see really the cost breakdown of different outages and what are our operational utility charges, and then what is the different microgrid scenarios. And so in our first iteration of our business case, where we're just looking at operational charges, not looking at a created value of resiliency, we can see that the microgrid investments is actually more than our operational utility charges. And the first scenario really showed that our microgrid wasn't going to really be a business case and pay for itself over a period of time unless we were experiencing a 5-day outage and our loss of load value from our load priority 2 to 5 buildings was so much that then the microgrid would essentially pay for itself. And so we know that that's not necessarily true. We know there's tremendous amount of value as a public entity to have power during outages. And so again, it really forced us to look at how do we value our different services and our organization internally, and then how do we apply those values to net present value calculations, as well as the different programs that we operate and future projects. We are going through the process now, after we've done our year's worth of measurement and verification, to update our business case around this and update our model, because we've also seen just on a operational utility charge almost 120% increase in cost escalation from our utility per kWh than when we were starting this project. Next slide. So after all that, and going through the process and building it, as Dima mentioned, we heard about the 4-pillar methodology and scorecard. And so we decided that it was really important for us to integrate this work that is going on and the work that we were doing around resiliency and begin to backcast the scorecard and how it relates to our project. And so I decided to go ahead and do this scorecard, but do it from really less of me being a technical expert, but if I was just another facilities manager at a community college. And so we went ahead and looked at this. I worked on this with our electricians to, again, get other facilities personnel who might be the ones who would help support a project like this at other colleges and universities. And so, we found that if we were going to prop up our entire campus without load shedding, we could do a 3-hour event, but we couldn't do a 4-hour event. If we load shed, we can serve our priority buildings, our load priority 1 buildings, indefinitely with solar and battery. And we can then serve our load priority 2 buildings, really dependent on the month out of the year and whether or not we are experiencing our peak months or not our peak months. Our load capacity, really, that was hard for us to figure out since it really depended on the time of year and whether or not we were load shedding or not load shedding. But we found that we could, really utilize, for the most part, if we load shed, to 50% of our critical loads, we could serve those. We could serve pretty much all of our priority loads, depending, right, on our load shedding flexibility. And then really, we can't really serve our discretionary loads. But again, really depends on the time of the year, and whether or not we are in like a summer session, or if we are in a fall semester, and experiencing a really extreme heat day, where all of our buildings are having to cool. That really depends on how much of the entire campus we can support. For our fuel availability, all of our fuel is for our microgrid is produced on site, and it's all wired infrastructure. We are focused and committed to a renewable energy only microgrid. It's important to note that being a public entity and a community college, we did have existing diesel genset assets that were separated by automatic transfer switches at some of our buildings. Those all serve tier 1 fire life safety loads that were existing. Through this project and process, we reached out, and we're really trying to understand our regulatory body's viewpoint of microgrids. And at the time of building out our microgrids, microgrids were not allowed to serve tier 1 fire life safety loads. That has changed, not only in relation to code, but also with our regulatory body, which is the Division of State Architects. And so that is an ongoing conversation that's occurring of, microgrids being allowed to serve tier 1 fire life safety loads, so you don't have to construct a diesel genset as part of a new project. And so the other item related to diesel gensets is that our grant from the California Energy Commission did not allow us to use any funds for fossil fuel assets. And we agreed with that. We really wanted to focus on, as I mentioned, our number 1 priority being greenhouse gas emissions reduction and mitigation. For startup and islanding, we scored in less than a minute. So as part of our technical challenges of our grant, we've been able to showcase what we call blinkless transitioning. So we are able to island away from the grid in under 2 cycles, which means that actually no computers turn off. And so we are able to achieve a blinkless capability. We do have black start capability in the event that a blinkless transfer fails or something occurs. But our black start procedures are a manual procedure to make sure that if the initial blinkless transition didn't occur, there's probably something else going on with our microgrid, and we need to inspect all of our assets. For notification time, notification helps, but we designed our system to be faster than a human can manually input. And so again, we would achieve a blinkless transition in under 2 cycles, which is about, between 30 and 60 milliseconds. Additionally, our load shed devices utilize a shunt trip where they can automatically load shed our buildings in the same speed of the island transition, so that we don't end up in a situation where we seamlessly island, but our load is more than we can support, and then we would crash. So we did account for that. For workforce requirements, we're able to access our microgrid remotely. So we gave us a 4. I do want to note that as of now, I am kind of the microgrid operator, and it is a very important question of whether California community colleges should begin to building capacity for facility staff to operate a microgrid, or because public employees are very expensive and capacity is low, whether or not we should be looking at energy as a service model where we have a third party that really operates our microgrid. So that is a very important total cost of ownership question we are asking. And then lastly, for Blue Sky Services, we are participating in demand response programs. We actually had one last night, and we have another one today that we are supporting. And then we can provide voltage and frequency control and regulation, but there's no program on the distribution level with our utility. And so we have that capability, but we don't support a program. Next slide. So we have a large number of future applications with the lessons learned from this project and the integration of the 4-pillar methodology. We are currently designing and building out a new center that's in the southwest part of Santa Rosa. It's our equity center. It focuses on providing English as a second language services, as well as community services to a part of Santa Rosa that was historically underserved. And so we are utilizing right now the SARA tool and the 4-pillar methodology in applying adaptation and resiliency analysis to that site while it's being designed. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a very strong believer in California community colleges, so much so that as part of this project and the lessons learned, we are having conversations with the Chancellor's Office of the California Community College System to see if we can really support the build out of California community colleges as resiliency centers. We know from our experience with the Tubbs fire and the Glass fire, in emergencies, everybody knows where their local community college is and they go straight to the parking lots. And communities, community colleges really provide not only significant community services, but have a lot of community trust. And so we think they could be really important future sites for resiliency centers. We are looking at reviewing and assessing and improving our system as well as building capacity. So what that means is we acknowledge that during the time of our project, we had a 4-story lab building that was built. That's almost 100,000 square feet. And we had that student housing project I mentioned. And so we see the need for an additional 2 megawatts of solar production, as well as trying to find a long duration energy storage capacity solution. So our hopeful goal is that we can get between 7 to 8 megawatt hours worth of capacity. And then lastly, we are a pretty urban campus in Santa Rosa, and we just wouldn't have the space for getting up to the 20 or 30 megawatt hours. And so we see energy efficiency as a tremendous value to us, and a tremendous teaching value. Our microgrid really allows me to have conversations with our community about being an active user of energy. And so we have a large number of buildings that still need LED retrofit upgrades, pumps and motors and compressors being changed out. And then finally, really focusing on passive design. So we have, being founded in 1918, we have a number of buildings that are significantly old that haven't been renovated yet. And so we are looking at projects where we can really focus on energy efficiency through passive design. So air tightness, looking at replacing windows, insulation, and then lastly, looking at new phase change material that really gives us the ability to have thermal energy storage in a passive way We see this as a really important technology in allowing our buildings to thermally flywheel, as is one terminology I've heard, when we need a load shed. And so we could focus first on turning off the heating and cooling systems and having built-in capacity in our buildings for folks to be comfortable. We are participating in a number of demand response and automated demand response events, and working actually with the California Energy Commission's new demand response center to focus on accepting pricing signals to really optimize demand response or load optimization. One of the things I'm excited that we're trying to pilot is utilizing heating and cooling demand response. But should someone be uncomfortable and we allow a building to cool or to heat, our battery would then discharge to really firm up the expected kW reduction. We see this as a really important way to help the state future-proof demand reduction in its demand response program. All of this resiliency work can't just occur in a silo in a facilities operations department. And so we need to take all of the data and all of our lessons learned and actually go back and update our specific data in the county's hazardous mitigation plan. We have to integrate everything around our microgrid with our district emergency management protocols and procedures. If I should disappear, is there a document for our electricians or even for one of our officers to come to site and know what to do on a simple level? And then lastly, ongoing operations and maintenance, and looking at what is the total cost of ownership to really run and operate a microgrid so that it will actually work. This looks at ongoing funding, but then ongoing testing. I will have to find times where now this is part of our emergency power system, where I will then have to test an island event and coordinate that around multiple departments, multiple constituents, and now students who are living on site 24/7. And so that provides a unique challenge in the ongoing operations of the system. And next slide. And that is it.
Great. Well, thank you, Dima and David, so much for the presentation. I think that was a really interesting look at how you're looking at your microgrid, and I think it's very illustrative of how sort of scalable that we are trying to make this four pillar methodology in terms of being able to have it be applied to large scale in front of the meter utility infrastructure, as we saw with San Diego's Borrego Springs example, but also potentially something like a behind the meter campus style microgrid like Santa Rosa is doing. And I think it's also a really good time to highlight this sort of thing that we're driving at, that resiliency really does mean different things to different people. And the way that you presented it, I think, was a really fantastic look at how, and a really deep dive into how you are looking at resiliency of your electrical system and how that impacts all of these interconnected services within the campus and also within the broader community that you serve. So I think this was a really fantastic presentation and really appreciate your time in doing it. So I think we'll move on to the Q&A section. I want to open it up to any of our panelists who might have questions or comments or anything of that sort.
Yes, thank you, Julian, and thank you, David and Dima. Another excellent presentation, really insightful. And your last point there, David, about who will operate the system if you turn into a pumpkin or something. You're not alone in that. In these microgrids that are not operated directly by the utility. And I think that's something that we need to pay attention to, as more like type microgrids are designed, funded, and deployed, is the sustainability, the person power sustainability, because these things need people. Okay? There isn't an artificial intelligence. I mean, there are aspects of AI to this, but at the end of the day, we very much need people, and I think that's not a bad thing. I think it's a good thing, because with the people to people aspect of this, there is that ability to really determine, are there some unique circumstances that maybe hasn't been programmed in and needs to have a decision made. And for Santa Rosa Junior College, the real life experience here in terms of wildfires, smoke, what happens to your solar array, and then just the detailed analysis, the very sophisticated analysis being used is just really insightful and exciting. So thank you. I've learned a lot already, and now I'll turn it back to the questions from folks who are participating in the public comment part. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Shiroma. I will ask one question. There was a comment in the Q&A section from Carol Boland Wadham about the Sarah tool and saying that she, quote, wanted one. But that does sort of lead me to a question. Is this Sarah tool being designed as something that's will be publicly available or open source, or is there, can you talk about the development pathway of the tool and potentially whether it might be available to folks to use for this purpose?
Yeah, I can speak to that, Julian. Thank you. And I do want to say, if you note on the first slide, we had another colleague from Center for Sustainable Energy listed, Chris Bogle, who was supposed to be here, but ended up not being able to make it just because some scheduling conflicts. And he's the individual that really developed the tool. So I kind of feel bad that he wasn't here to talk about it and to hear all the glowing comments, but I will relay them. But to your question.
Okay, Julian, do you want me to do some closing remarks at this point? All right. Well, again, thank you to San Diego Gas and Electric, Santa Rosa Junior College, Stacy at San Diego, Dimi and David, the team for the Santa Rosa College. Just really, really impressive work and exemplifying, applying the 4 pillars and that baseline assessment. What protection options do you have for the mitigation measurement assessment? What's the best job of protecting the most? What does it cost? Then your resiliency scorecard, and then the resiliency response assessment. How well is it operating? And I really appreciate that there's not one size that fits all, and that some of this is just very organic in terms of addressing the particular situation that you are looking to mitigate, and your projects are very informative. They are sure to help inform other developers, and again, in using this 4-pillar process, helps to inform best practices for the future. Again, realizing one size does not fit all, but meanwhile, again, the whole point too about the sustainability in terms of the sheer operation and understanding of the microgrid is a key attribute. So I do want to thank all of our presenters today, our CPUC team, and all of the folks who tuned in and with the great questions that were posed. Thank you, and back to Julian and Roseanne.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Shiroma. And with that, we'll pass it to Roseanne to talk about the upcoming workshops we have.
Thanks, Jillian. Thank you everyone for joining us with this. The recording will be posted on our website in about 2 to 4 business days. So please feel free to review and send any questions or inquiries to Jillian or myself, and I'll give you our contact information on the next slide. So we have 2 more workshops coming up. One is on November 8th. Lumen Energy Strategy will be discussing the third doing the third of their 3 workshops on resiliency standards, discussing methodologies to apply the 4-pillar methodology from a bulk grid planning perspective, focusing on IRP. And then our last workshop of the year will be November 28th, and that will be the final report of the RenCat pilot project being conducted by Sandia, National Labs, and SCE. As you recall, in July, we had a kickoff of that project, and that is focused on the social burden index that could potentially be a useful metric to engage or integrate into the work that we've talked about today that would bring in that equity aspect. So please tune into those 2 events. I believe the service list announcement for November 8th has gone out, and the service list announcement for the November 28th will be going out presently. Thank you everyone for joining us. And this is our contact information should you have any questions or thoughts further. Thank you again.
Thank you all, and have a wonderful rest of your day. We appreciate you joining.